שלום שלום, זה תענוג וכבוד בשבילי להיות פה איתכם לדבר על נושא שמעניין אותנו במיוחד, שזה הנושא של סוגיות חברתיות. אז אתחיל בעברית ואחרי זה אעבור לאנגלית כשאני אגיע ללב של הנאום שלי. אז אני התחלתי ב-2000 לחשוב איך החברה שלנו ואיך הממשלות שלנו מטפלים בסוגיות חברתיות. Now we are all very much, now I've proven I can speak Hebrew, I'm going to switch to English. We're all very much aware that social issues are not being dealt with in a way that is reducing their importance in society. We find that they spread instead of shrinking, that they become intergenerational, as Philip Larkin, a British poet, said, man hands on misery to man. And philanthropists, like all of you here today, or many of you here today, have tried for centuries to try to deal with them. In fact, philanthropists were the ones who started to deal with social issues, not governments, in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, governments began to give them tax advantages, and we saw the creation of new foundations. And then by the 1930s, governments began to get involved directly. By the 1940s, we began to get welfare states. And today, welfare states are throwing up their hands in the face of social issues. And that includes the British government and the Israeli government and all the G8 governments and most governments around the world. Governments everywhere are staring at a huge gap ahead of them between the demand for social services and the resources that they have available for them. Since 2008, expenditure on social services across all G8 countries have been static. And we have new social issues beginning to appear on the horizon of massive scale. The issue of the aging poor is one in particular. Issues of health, epidemics, pandemics. I'll be talking about Israel's efforts in the area of diabetes to create a diabetes social impact bond to prevent type 2 diabetes. And so in 2000, I was asked by the British government to look at this issue. And I discovered that really the only part of our system that deals directly with social issues is the social sector, which we used to call the third sector. But we decided you couldn't really be proud of being third in anything. And the social sector has a lot to be proud about. And when you look at the social sector across the world, it's huge. In the UK, it has 800,000 people working in it. Across Europe, 11 million people working in not-for-profit organizations. And yet the one characteristic that all of these organizations have in common is they don't have money. And as a result of that characteristic, they don't have scale. And the reason is us. It's all of us in this room. Why are we the cause of that? We're the cause of that because when we give philanthropically, we say to the not-for-profit service provider, here's money for 2 or 3 years. Do your best with it, but after that, please go raise money from somebody else. And please don't spend any money on your overheads. The result is that nobody can achieve size. So I began to ask myself the question, how is it that we've been able to give young entrepreneurs in technology and other areas, dropouts from school, the risk capital to create a revolution in the way we live, and we're unable to give social entrepreneurs and social organizations that are devoting their lives to helping others the means to do the same. And now I fast forward from 2000 to today, And as chair of the G8 Task Force on Social Impact Investment, I'm here to tell you that we're on the brink of a revolution. We're on the brink of a revolution in tackling social issues. And the revolution is coming because we've begun to understand that you can measure social performance. You can measure an improvement in the number of prisoners who go back to jail after their release at the age of 21. You can measure the number of homeless people. You can measure the dropout rate from school. UBS just invested in a Rajasthan social impact bond for girls dropping out of primary school. You can measure the number of youth who are unemployed, and you can reduce it. You can measure the number of Haredim who get into jobs relative to the traditional trends, or of Arab women who get into jobs. And once you can begin to measure social performance, you can begin to link it to a financial return. And the breakthrough came in 2010 when a team that I'm very proud to say I co-founded, which was located in the basement of my office in London, in Portland Place, came up with the idea that you can link an improvement in reoffending by prisoners to a financial return. And I would like to describe to you the social impact bond, because the social impact bond is the first expression of what I'm talking about. And from this concept, everything else flows. So we went in 2010 to the Ministry of Justice, and we said, in Britain, like everywhere else, 60% of youth reoffend within 18 months of their release. We will raise £5 million. We will invest in 4 or 5 not-for-profits, and over 5 years we will help them, we being Social Finance UK, we will help them to reduce the rate of reoffending. If we fail to reduce it by 7.5%, the money's lost. It was a philanthropic donation, £5 million. But if we succeed in reducing the rate of reoffending by 7.5% to 15%, then the government will pay back the £5 million and an increasing rate of interest from 2 to 13%. And the punchline, ladies and gentlemen, is government would be paying out 1/3 of the saving in the first year alone from not taking these young people through the law courts back into prison. So that is the concept of the social impact bond. I was going to show you a chart, but maybe you don't need it. So the first social impact bond was launched in 2010. Today, there are 26 across the world. Oh, here it is. Okay. I tried both, so which is the other? The green next. I tried it. Okay. So the social impact bond, I'll come back to the chart. There are now 26 social impact bonds. The last one was just launched in Chicago by Rahm Emanuel as mayor of Chicago for young children from the age of 4 onwards from difficult backgrounds who have a very high dropout rate. Whereas in 2010, people thought that only prisoners could be dealt with because all the information was available on police computers. Today, there are a dozen social issues that are being tackled through social impact bonds. Issues you wouldn't have dreamt could be dealt with, like adoption, like foster parentage, difficult families, children from difficult families, and so on. And so the social impact bond, as you can see, is really an agreement between the government or a foundation or corporation or all three of them with an organization like Social Finance, and Social Finance Israel exists and will, I hope, become a leader in this field. Yaron Neudorfer, the CEO, is sitting here in the audience. And this organization acts a bit like a venture capitalist. It identifies charitable and for-profit sector service providers. It monitors them, And it measures the number of beneficiaries whose lives have improved. Now, why is this the beginning of a revolution? It's the beginning of a revolution because we now have a mechanism to tap the $46 trillion which have signed up to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment. To tap your resources. You're here because you're interested in achieving more than just financial return when you make investments, at least for some of your portfolio. So if you got 2% of 46 trillion, you'd be at $1 trillion. And one of the chapters of the G8 report, from which this diagram is taken, deals precisely with this issue, the first trillion. How do we get to the first trillion? The second reason this is going to be huge, in my view, is the millennial generation. There are two generations interested in pushing this forward. One is the millennial generation of people who want to find added meaning beyond just making a profit in their day-to-day activities, to do good and to do well at the same time. And then there's my generation, or the generations in between, the grey wave, as I like to call it, which is also very conscious of the need to help tackle social issues in a way that is more innovative, more entrepreneurial, and that brings the capital markets to fund the efforts of government to be innovative, to pay on the basis of success. And the third reason is the one we've already dealt with, which is governments. So I will just show you one more slide, and then we can go to questions. If you ask today, where can one invest? You can invest in what are known impact-driven organizations. You can access these organizations through funds or through instruments such as the social impact bond. I've invested in 2 social impact bonds. You can all invest in a social impact bond. You can hope to make 6 or 7% on your money in a cause that you believe in. If you fail, it was a philanthropic donation. If you succeed, you get your money plus 7% a year or so in a range, and you can reinvest it in good things. Or you can invest in funds, which are social impact bond funds or social venture funds. And this chart, it's a bit too filled with detail to be able to go through it, looks at the opportunity to invest in impact-driven businesses, which are seeking to make a profit but to lock in a social mission, and social sector organizations which limit their profitability or have no profitability at all and use a social impact bond to fund their growth. And you can look at different investment profiles on the left. Investments that generate competitive financial returns. What we've discovered is there's not necessarily a trade-off between social return and financial return. Investments which generate a below-market financial return, but an attractive, measurable social return. And there's a revolution in the making because government, say the UK government, has now posted on the web, you can access it through the Cabinet Office website, the cost of 640 social issues. You can discover that a reoffending prisoner costs £22,000. A kid that's taken into care by government costs £63,000 a year. And that enables you to calculate a social rate of return. If you rehabilitate 1,000 prisoners, it's worth £22 million. On a £10 million social impact bond over 5 years, that's 15%. So there are some investments, and a lot of philanthropists are interested in them, that generate below market financial returns, but high social returns. And then there are others that achieve very little financial return. Very little financial return, but are still very attractive. Now, why I'll close with this. Why is this a revolution? If we start with philanthropists or foundations that philanthropists have set up, through impact investment, they can access investments that are uncorrelated with stock markets but achieved the social objectives that led to their creation. If you can achieve 7% uncorrelated returns in the absolute return part of your portfolio, that's obviously very interesting. It's not impossible to think that 5% of foundation portfolios would be allocated to impact investments of this kind. If we did that, we would match all the philanthropic giving across the world by foundations. In the United States alone, it would be $55 billion. So we have a new instrument. It's powerful in terms of its social effect. It's powerful in terms of its financial return. We want to make a revolution, and I think Israel is capable of leading in that revolution. Thank you very much.
So, Sir Ronald, the first social impact bond was launched at 2010. We're now almost in 2015, and we now have 26 social impact bonds across the world. So that's, growth, but it's not exploding. So why is it taking so long, this revolution that you're describing?
So the reason it's taking such a long time, Uri, is as you saw from the diagram on the social impact bond, maybe we can switch off the projector. As you saw in the diagram in the social impact bond, it takes 3 to tango in this case, not 2, but 3. You need the government. Most of the social impact bonds have government paying out, to shift its mindset from saying we're going to pay for success. We're going to measure. We accept that investors will make a return, but that return and the capital they expend will be only a portion of the savings that we make. And it's taking 18 months for a government to get around the process and to launch a social impact bond if they're starting from scratch. So here in Israel, we've been very busy talking with government ministries. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is investors. Investors don't have allocations to impact yet. It was the same with venture capital when I started out. If you go to the chief investment officer of the foundations in this room, he will say to you, you know what, I don't have a place in which to put this. We are now giving a framework for that. We're saying you can have impact public equity, you can have impact fixed income, impact debt, like vaccination bonds, you can have impact real estate, impact venture capital, impact private equity, impact absolute return. So the allocation needs to be set. Now there's a framework for it. The third is social sector organizations. Organizations which have been starved of capital for their whole life now have the opportunity to scale up. But they need to recruit people to do that. They need to develop the data that gives investors a sense of the track record that they have achieved in the past so that they risk it now. So for instance, if you look at the diabetes social impact bond we're trying to launch in Israel, we're negotiating with the Department of, we're talking to the Department of Health, we're negotiating with Kalalit and with Bituach Leumi, we're negotiating with the Treasury, with the Otsar, which has to bless that. We're negotiating on the other side with organizations that can help pre-diabetics avoid diabetes, and we're talking to potential investors, including UBS, as it happens.
So compared to the US and the UK, where you also have social impact bonds, how is it going in Israel? I mean, do you get cooperation? Can Israel become a leader here, or?
So, I mean, Israel's tech industry started in 92, 93. And again, as Apex, I was privileged to launch the first large institutional fund, the first Apex fund. The fact that we were 20 years behind the United States didn't mean we could, didn't mean we failed to overtake everybody else. And apart from Silicon Valley, we are the only place, really, where there's a very high concentration of tech startups. I think the same can be true in this area of social entrepreneurship and investment. And I'm proud to say that Israel was invited to present to the G8 task force and did a social finance. Israel did a great job of putting on the table two innovative ideas that affect all G8 countries and most other countries in the world. The issue of diabetes, where 300 million people across the world are pre-diabetic and 400 million suffer from type 2 diabetes. And the issue of dropout rates from universities. In Israel, as it turns out, if you look at engineering studies in Michlalot and universities, there's a 56% dropout rate. And in Italy, there's a 20% dropout rate across all education. Across the OECD, there's a 14%, 14% dropout rate. So Israel has already innovated by focusing on issues that others haven't yet picked up. The challenge now is to get it done. The challenge now is to be able to get the decisions at the level of government, department, ministries, and to raise the capital and to get the organizations that can make it happen to prepare their business plans, if we can call it that, social business plans, so that they can hit the objectives that are set. So, and you target not only institutional investors, but also high net worth individuals? Yes, I mean, the people who are really driving this forward at the moment are a small number of foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Case Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation in the UK, and high net worth individuals. So one individual's charitable trust in the United States invested $4 million in a reoffending bond. So high net worth individuals have the ability to make bold decisions, bolder decisions than institutional investors. And they are driving the market at the moment. Okay, in conclusion, I want to talk about an issue that is, a big issue in Israel, in the UK as well, and almost everywhere else, which is the cost of living and, the income and wealth gap between those who did well and a lot of the rest. And I know, for example, that you were seen in the social protests on Rothschild Avenue in 2011. So why should someone who, has done well, why should they care about how the rest are doing? So my generation was brought up around the slogan of equality of opportunity. Today, that slogan looks like an empty phrase, because if you're born into the wrong family, you have little chance of escaping poverty if both your parents are unemployed or have a drug habit or whatever. And inequality in society creates very real problems in terms of the cohesion of society, but it's also a terrible waste of human talent and resources. Now, what affects the gap? Of course, there are books that have been written now by Piketty and others about how a redistribution of income has not been sufficient. But even if you redistribute income, the degree to which you're going to be able to close the gap may not be sufficient. And the reason I went to the protest is that I empathized with people who are hardworking, who have served the country in every way, and are still not able to lead a decent life. At one level, this has to do with government allocation of resources. I'm not going to get into issues of how the Israeli government has allocated its resources, but the British government has had certain priorities, has allocated in certain ways, and there are certain consequences to that. The same is true in Israel. And it seems to me that if you do not tackle these issues early, they're going to be a lot more difficult to tackle subsequently. Now, for me, one of the big issues in the protest was the question of shivyon hanetel, the question of people bearing an equal burden. And the work that we had done on social impact bonds made us very much aware that the Haredi community in Israel is a huge pool of talent, and that we ought to find ways of getting them into jobs. And getting them into jobs may mean that they have to get into the army first, and all sorts of things follow from that. Now, as a person who left Egypt as a refugee, was lucky enough to land in Britain, and luckier still to marry a wonderful Israeli woman, and to live a good chunk of my life in Israel now. I feel a responsibility for trying to help those who've had a rougher time. And I'm sure that's true of all the people. I know many people in this audience who have been similarly fortunate or even more fortunate, and who feel the same sense of obligation. But up until now, apart from protest, there were no real tools for doing it. Now we have tools that are as powerful as the tools that brought about the technological revolution to do it. And they can show government how to do things better through innovation. They can bring the risk to the investor away from government. You can't innovate without risk. We don't need to say, to repeat that here in Israel. And they can bring resources to do this at scale. So it seems to me that we have an opportunity today to use our capital, in addition to our philanthropic giving, in revolutionary ways in terms of our approach to social issues.
Sir Ronald Cohen, תודה רבה.